Hello, everyone. This is episode 6 of Educational Assessment with Professor DeNobile. I am your host, Professor DeNobile, and this is Defining Learning Objectives, also known as Learning Targets. Today's agenda: the formative instructional practice, FIP, learning targets and why they're important, different types of learning targets, writing student-friendly learning targets, and what to consider when you're writing your learning targets. So, as part of the formative instructional practice, or FIP, this is the process for teachers and students in understanding how we get from point A to point B. Point A is where the students are currently at, which is over here, and getting them to where they're supposed to be. And the reason why I say supposed to be is because these are based off of the standards. This is where the state or what other entity has created these standards. This is where they have said this is where the students need to be. So this is where they're supposed to be based off of the organization who created those standards. So the formative instructional plan is, how do we get from point A to point B? Here's what we're going to do to close this gap. That's the formative instructional practice. This includes collecting evidence to inform our learning. How do we collect evidence? Well, evidence is done through assessment, which includes student assessment and student regulation. Why is this important? Because the goal for students is self-autonomy. It's for them to become lifelong learners. So while, yes, it is our job as teachers to assess the learning of our students, it's also our job to help them self-regulate, to help them assess themselves, to help them ask the questions that they need to do in order to learn. And as always, this isn't assessment for the sake of assessment in order to just get numbers to create grade books. The purpose of assessment is to continue build on the learning. So we oftentimes as teachers get caught up in, well, we have to create this test because they read the book, if it's English, for example, and we have to test to see, did they understand it? We need to get grades for our grade book, or we need to do this math test because it's time. The assessment should also be an activity that not only measures learning, but also is part of the process of learning. And we're going to talk at the end of this presentation of how you create feedback out of your learning targets. Your feedback is continuing the process of learning. Oops. Didn't mean to do product placement. We're going to look at not this type of target. It's not this type of target. There we go. It's this type of target. Here we go. All right. So you got to start with clear standards-based learning targets, which are derived from the standards. But your learning targets is what you start with. And why is all this important? Because your learning targets is how we're going to create accurate, aligned assessments. Your assessments have to be aligned with these learning targets. Otherwise, you're wasting everyone's time. You're wasting your time. You're wasting your students' time. You're wasting the school's time. You're wasting the state's time. If your assessments are not aligned with the learning targets, that's like going somewhere new and not using the GPS. I use the GPS every day, even when I go to work, because I don't know if I'm going to hit major traffic. So I may have to go around another way. I need to assess my route in order to make sure that I'm going in the right direction, or that I'm going to get there in the intended destination at the intended time. Once we have created our assessments, and again, this is the UBD, the understanding by design, the backwards design model. So we started with the standards to create our learning targets. We've created assessments, and now we can design lessons because now we have the destination. We know where we're going to go. So now we can start building the map. And once we build the map, then we execute the map. We instruct, which leads us to data collection. The process of executing our instruction is so that we can get to the assessments to collect our data, which then will inform us, are they meeting the learning targets? Do we need to adjust? And then we're going to start the process all over again. This is a cycle. This is just a cycle that's going to keep on going every single school year. You're gonna have your standards. Your unit 1 is going to be, you're going to create standard based learning targets for unit 1. You're going to create assessments for unit 1. You're going to create the lessons for unit 1. Then you're going to teach unit 1. Now you may not write all of the lessons for unit 1, but you're going to have a basic understanding of what the roadmap is going to be for unit 1. Then you're going to execute the day-by-day lessons. You're going to collect your data, and it's going to start all over again. Why are clear learning targets important? Well, as we said before, it's all about alignment. It's all about getting from point A to point B. But you can't go from point A to point B if you don't know where point B is. So it's to align our formative and summative assessments, which in turn will align our lessons, because our lessons have to get us. Your lessons are point A, but you do your lessons after you know where point B is. Then we're going to deliver our instruction that matches the intended learning in the learning targets. And then here is also why it's important. Clear learning targets provides descriptive feedback for students and teachers, and this evaluative feedback needs to be focused on how well the student mastered the learning. And then, but this is for both teachers and students. So for teachers, clear learning targets clarify from the start the criteria for their grading. It monitors learning by tracking goals and targets rather than activities, provides ample penalty-free learning opportunities, and it gives evaluative feedback that supports the learning. Now, for students, remember, we want them to become as autonomous as possible. So clear learning targets allows students to understand and articulate the criteria for their grading. They're taught to monitor their own learning by tracking the learning targets that they've mastered and those that they have not. And the clear learning targets also provides many penalty-free learning opportunities, and they have to know when it counts. The point is this. Students oftentimes, especially at the upper grades, they often get caught up in the grades, the numbers. And really, that's not where the learning is. The learning is not in the GPA. A higher GPA does not necessarily mean that student A knows more than student B because they have 10 percentage points higher than the other one. It doesn't mean they know 10% more than the other student. GPAs are just ways to keep everybody accountable, to quantify where students are at. But the grade number does not necessarily mean that the students are there. But the point is this: we want them to fall in love with learning more so than necessarily falling in love with the number, the grade. So we want to create opportunities throughout our lessons where it will become a penalty-free environment, a penalty-free learning environment. This can be seen as enrichment. This can be seen as, extra credit. If you want to, instead of it being a penalty, it's like, if you do this activity, it's only going to help you. It's not going to hurt you. Students will actually understand and know when they're being evaluated and when it truly counts. That's what the learning targets really show them. So at the end of the day, can your students answer these two questions? Where am I going? What did I do today? I think about this, think about growing up, when your parent or guardian picked you up from school. or you were sitting around the dinner table, one of the first things is, what did you learn today in school? The answer to these questions should be the learning target. What are you learning in your math class? The student should be rattling off learning targets. What are you learning in science? The student should be rattling off learning targets. What did you learn today in Spanish class? They should be able to recite the learning target. This is why it's also important we said about unpacking the standards to write the learning targets. This is why it's important within daily lessons to unpack the learning target at the beginning of the lesson and then review at the end of the lesson of whether or not the students achieved the learning target for that day. Because if students can evaluate, this is the learning target, okay, what's the expectation for today? Then they go through their learning activity for the day. Did we achieve that learning target? If they're able to answer that question, they can demonstrate their learning, and that's immediate assessment and immediate feedback. I really loved in the textbook, pages 31 to 35, the different types of learning targets. I just want to quickly review them here. I'll be honest with you, your day-to-day, you're not going to be, yes, there's content learning targets, there's language learning targets. You're gonna see more of that in your daily practice. You know, your supervisor's not gonna on the spot ask you, what's the performance skill target for today? Like, it's not gonna be like that. But in understanding how you have these different types of learning targets really helps you understand the different types of activities that you're going to build later on, for formative learning, for summative learning, as well as those assessments. So the most common type is your knowledge and understanding. That's your most common type of learning target. They're also known as content learning targets or declarative learning targets. This is also understanding knowledge as a hierarchy, starting with facts and working your way up to general concepts. Knowledge and understanding is in every single discipline, because in order to do anything else, you need to have basic understanding and basic knowledge in literature, in mathematics, in science. So your most common is going to be these knowledge and understanding learning targets. Examples are in the textbook. I highly recommend, if you haven't read the textbook already, to go back to it. Your reasoning learning targets apply the knowledge and understanding to solve problems. That's what a reasoning learning target is. How are we going to apply reason in order to solve this problem before us? The first thing I think of are like word problems in math. Word problems in math are really good assessment tools, because a math teacher is not simply asking you to add, subtract. They're not simply asking you to do that. They're giving you a situation, they're giving you a scenario, and they're asking you to reason your way through and apply whatever the concept was. So, for example, I always think of, like, in geometry, one of my favorite word problems in geometry is like, we're cleaning out the gutters. So here is the house. It is this side of the wall, and the house is 10 feet tall, and you have a ladder that's 11 feet. And so you're leaning your ladder up against the house. How far is the bottom of the house and the bottom of the ladder? And you have to use the Pythagorean theorem in order to do it. But the question does not say use the Pythagorean theorem in order to solve this triangle. You have to know, you have to reason your way through that based off of the description of the house, that you need to use the Pythagorean theorem. Why is that important? Because it's a higher depth of knowledge. It's a higher bloom. It's asking you to do more than simply recite off the top of your head. Then you have the performance skill learning target, which develops the capacity to perform and use strategies to sustain learning. Another way I see this one is it's applying your reasoning to perform a specific um it's the skill. um so you need to have your knowledge and reasoning in order to develop this skill. That's what I was going for. um in order to sustain your learning. So it's not simply enough to know something, it's not simply enough to reason your way through it. What's the skill that you're developing? Because that skill is what's going to help you long term. And in many cases, in different disciplines, if you're not able to perform skill A, it's going to be really difficult to get to skill B and learn skill B. Product development: how do you apply your skills to create a product? Your product development typically is in literature. It's like construct a an argumentative essay, construct a literary analysis, um, and so forth. Dispositional targets go beyond academic achievement. They're affective, their personal feelings. There's some one type is social emotional learning targets or benchmarks. Um, there's also appreciating discipline targets. So, for example, in English, there's typically somewhere in the learning targets, uh, developing an appreciation for different genres of literature, or in history, developing an appreciation for different time periods, or developing an appreciation for different geographic areas and different geographic regions. Well, appreciation is not necessarily for academic achievement, but it's for learning motivation. If a student cannot appreciate poetry, it's going to be a lot more difficult to learn poetry. So that's why you have some of these dispositional targets that are not necessarily about academic achievement. However, they really help on the other end in order to actually do the learning. So, in a way, the dispositional targets assist in the achievement targets. Um, so learning targets, the knowledge, skills, reasoning products that make up the standards, also the dispositional targets that are related to the standards. We unpacked the standards we learned in the last module with verbs, nouns, and rigor. So how do we extract the verbs, nouns, and rate the level of rigor based on the Hess matrix, the Hess rigor matrix? That's how we get to the learning target. Decide on the larger goal. This is the UBD. The larger goal is about independent transfer, life. So how does this standard, when we bring it into a learning target, how is it going to be transferred? Because they need to learn this target not simply to pass that test at the end of the year, the standardized exam, although that is important, but the greater principle, the greater goal is how are they going to develop this understanding, this skill, this writing this product in order to be successful in life. Rewrite the standard into smaller pieces. This is the knowing, understanding, skill, product piece. Rewrite the scaffolded tiered order into student-friendly language. This is very key because standards are written in educational jargon. They're teacher speak. They're meant for us to understand what we have to do as part of our job. But students, we need to simplify it while also being understanding that vocabulary is important. So, for example, in science class, The standard might include science jargon, but it's part of your task. It's not to oversimplify it. We may need to scaffold up in order to teach the students the proper vocabulary needed in order to perform the task, in order to understand a concept in science or in any other subject. Oftentimes, the student-friendly language is I can statements. I know, like, my everyday lesson plans, I need to write I can learning targets. And the reason why, it's because when students are unpacking the learning target, they're saying I can do this. And if they can say I can do this, they know what the parameters are and what they're supposed to be able to do by the end of this particular lesson. We are learning to blank. Students will be able to blank. I know blank. So this is student-friendly language that really allows students to really pick apart and understand where their learning is going to go. So a little bit more on these student-friendly learning targets. If we take reading informational texts, grade 6.1, this standard says cite textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. So what level of rigor do I need to get to in order for students to really understand this particular, or to demonstrate this particular learning target? That activity has to be a Bloom's level 4, because they're saying that they have to analyze. And DOK 3 on the Hess rigor matrix. Now, what's also important is this: even though I may be a 6th grade English teacher, I need to know where the 7th grade teacher is going to go next year, because that gives me, remember how we said before in the PIF, this is where you're supposed to be at, this is where you're at, this is where you're supposed to be at. So by the end of 6th grade, they're supposed to be here. By the end of 7th grade, they're supposed to be here. This gives me a little bit of leeway. Even though the grade 7 one is way far out, it gives me a place to go in order to know, like, what are some things that I can add in 6th grade to help bolster what the 7th grade teacher is going to be doing next year. So next year for 7th grade, it says cite several pieces of textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. So the biggest difference here is that this says cite textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly. Cite several pieces of textual evidence. So here I know that as the school year goes on, to increase the rigor, I can add, or I can ask my students to cite more than one piece of textual evidence, because in 7th grade, they're going to be asked to cite several pieces of textual evidence. This leads us to understanding tiered instruction, going beyond the learning cognitive rigor, the stretch. For those of you who know zone of proximal development, that's what we're talking about here. What are the opportunities to go beyond the learning target? Because if we can stretch them a little bit beyond the learning target, they're going to end up at the learning target. That's the theory there, that if we can stretch them just beyond, they're going to land somewhere in the middle. They're going to land in that zone as best as possible. Higher level Blooms and DOK, additional grade level content. How can we set up our instruction so that we can build for student success? Your student-friendly learning targets: I can support my analysis of a text with additional outside readings, meaning I can use multiple sources. So this is for 6th grade in preparation for 7th. Or you can say, I can support my analysis of a text with strong support from the text or outside resources, meaning irrefutable or research facts or inferences. Now, here's the point here. It's one standard, but out of that one standard, we can write multiple learning targets depending on what lesson we want to teach for that particular day. So within a particular unit, I may be focusing on one standard in a given week, but I may be looking at different aspects of that standard. I can write 5 different learning targets for that particular week based off of one standard. That's the only point that I wanted to share that with you. So what to consider when writing your learning targets? What do students need in order to master the learning targets? And what prior knowledge or baseline do they need to already be at in order to later on master the learning targets? So your mastery of the learning targets is the minimum level that all students need to master and self-reflect at the grade level. Remember, the standards are the bare minimum. It's the basement. And so we need to know, how can we get all of our students at that base, at that ground level, while also shooting to go beyond the standards. I can write a paragraph or an essay to support my reasoning by presenting details found in a text. I can do this if the details are stated and inferred. This is going back to the same standard from the 6th grade standard in the last slide. I can analyze informational texts if I can evaluate parts of it, stated and implied. I know I cannot support reasoning with my own opinion. So the whole point here is, when you're writing your learning targets, by reflecting on how students can master the learning targets for that standard, we can figure out what are these tiered learning targets in between in order to get them to that high level learning target. Well, if they cannot support reasoning with their own opinion, you're going to have to do a lesson on supporting reasoning with their opinion. So that's that part. So prior knowledge is very important. Prior knowledge is the knowledge and skills students must have to accomplish learning targets. One of the things that we have seen over the last 25 years for students who were born after 1995, I would say, for students born after 1995, their prior knowledge, their prior experience has dwindled because of technology. More students are spending more time on cell phones, playing video games, on the internet, and they don't really have a lot of life experience compared to students of the same age in prior generations. Why is this important? Because if you don't know what your students' prior knowledge is, you could be setting a foundation on sand and not realizing that you're kind of wasting everyone's time, because you're teaching a lesson, but the students, they have no clue where you're starting from. So for example, I can use a quote from a text to support my answer. If a student doesn't understand how to quote something, this learning target is going to be extremely difficult for them. I can recognize and answer a text inference question. I can answer knowledge recall questions about a text. I can scan a text for keywords to answer questions about a text. Well, in order for them to cite textual evidence, if they don't know how to scan a text, you may have to teach it, because maybe a teacher taught them in prior years. Maybe a teacher in a prior year never taught them how to scan a text because it wasn't being tested on their standardized exam. So we have to understand that not all of our students are going to be coming into our classes with the same experiences, with the same prior knowledge of each other, or even where you were at when you were at their age. So if we don't understand where the students' prior knowledge is, or what their baseline understanding is, which you get out of a diagnostic exam, as an example, it's going to be very difficult for them to master the learning targets that you're constructing for a given unit of study. So, in summary, the formative instructional practice is a process for teachers and students to bridge the gap between what students currently know and do and get to where they should know and do based on the standards written by the state or any other organization. It starts with writing clear learning targets, which will align to everything else in the instructional practice, the assessments, the lesson design, the instruction, the data collection. When writing learning targets, we need to consider what students need to know and do to master the standards and what prior knowledge or baseline targets they need to know or meet in order to attempt mastery. Formulating learning targets is another example of how assessment drives instruction. When we construct very strong learning targets, we can create very strong formative and summative assessments, which then allows us to create very strong lesson designs. That is it for episode 6, and I will speak to you soon. Have a nice day.